Hello and welcome to Conversations in Cleantech, the podcast that celebrates the clean tech industry and the people that power it, brought to you by Brightsmith. I'm your host, Jenny Gladman, and in this sixth season, we delve deeper into the world of clean tech startups and their founders, from inspiring stories and words of wisdom to the toughest challenges. You can expect to learn about how these pioneering startups and the founders at their helm are propelling us towards a cleaner, greener tomorrow. In addition, they'll be offering you timeless teachings to enlighten, engage, and inspire everyone, everywhere to live their purpose. So I'm very excited to have a new co-host joining me today. Alexa is Brightsmith's very own carbon geek. She is one of the founding members of the Women in Carbon initiative. She has an academic background in sustainability and a love of all things nature. So Alexa, welcome to my side of the table.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks so much for the introduction. I'm super excited to announce today's guest. We'll be joined by someone who's very special, someone who's very passionate and dedicated to the environment, as well as an inspiration to all female entrepreneurs. Her unwavering determination is committed to helping the VCM scale and secure crucial funding for nature-based solutions. Ana Haurie, CEO and co-founder of Respira International, thank you for joining this conversation in Cleantech. We're super excited to have you, and we're really keen to hear about Respira and about yourself. Would you be able to kind of start off by sharing the story of Respira's creation and what inspired you to start this venture?
Sure, and thank you very much for having me with you today, and thank you for such a lovely introduction as well. It's really interesting because I find myself now in my mid-50s becoming an activist, something that I wasn't when I was a lot younger. So I think I'm doing it back to front. But the inspiration for starting Respira really came from a company that I was working with, helping them raise funding. And that company was a sustainable forestry logging business based in Peru, in Iquitos. And we were struggling to raise money for it. And this was around 2018, where at the same time, we also noticed that there was a significant change in attitudes towards climate change. That sort of whole debate of is it real or not real largely had gone away, particularly here in Europe. And we started to see Extinction Rebellion and Greta really doing an amazing job of raising awareness of the problem of climate change. And this was obviously preceded and supported by the Paris Agreement and all the top-down regulatory pressures that are being put on companies to disclose their carbon footprints, compliance markets. And we had an aha moment where we thought, well, hang on a second, we shouldn't be raising money to cut down trees, sustainable though it is, because the problem of illegal deforestation is quite significant. So this is a way of tackling it. But actually, we should be finding ways to reward nature and pay nature for the ecosystem services that it's providing. And that's where we thought, right, there is a significant business opportunity here, but one where we can make a real impact and a real contribution to the fight against climate change. And that's why we set up Respira.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. And for those who aren't familiar with the voluntary carbon market, would you be able just to provide some insight as to why it's essential that we support and finance carbon projects from your perspective?
I think we need to take a step back first. Nature, and what do we mean by nature? Everything from improved agricultural management to avoided deforestation to reforestation, restoring degraded lands, mangrove restoration, protection of biodiversity. The scope is significant. And nature on its own can account for around 25% of the emissions reductions that we need to make by 2030 if we're going to hold the rate at which the world is warming up. So, that's the really important piece. Nature and nature-based solutions require something like $398 billion of investment per annum between now and 2030 if we're going to stand a chance of meeting the targets that we have been setting ourselves. So that's why nature is really important. The voluntary carbon markets are one sector in this effort for financing nature-based solutions. And the role that it plays is essentially it puts the price on the carbon dioxide that has either been removed from the atmosphere or we have avoided from emitting into the atmosphere. Could be from cutting down trees. Just coming back to trees, this is where I've become a passionate advocate. But deforestation accounts for 10 to 15% of emissions every year. So you can see that nature can play a really significant role in this. And the trick is, how do we create those economic incentives to make it worthwhile to protect nature? And that is the role that the voluntary carbon markets can play. It puts a price on, well, again, let me take a step back. If you remove a ton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through planting a tree, you can then issue a carbon credit against that removal ton. There's a whole rigorous process around that, but I'm not going to go into the whole kind of sort of technical aspects of it. I'm just trying to keep this really high level. And then those carbon credits can be bought by corporates as part of their actions towards mitigating climate change. Obviously, they first of all have to decarbonize their own operations, but they can also compensate for their own emissions on that pathway. And so they can buy these carbon credits in the voluntary carbon markets and use it, as I said, as compensation. Those revenues then flow back to the project developers and the communities in predominantly the global south. And so they, at the same time, are deriving economic rewards and returns from protecting nature.
It's so interesting to hear. And I know that the voluntary carbon market is obviously only one side of it, and it's constantly being defined, and also a market that is under a lot of scrutiny at the minute. And I think that it's really important to hear from voices like yours in kind of understanding why it is important, why that we support these. But also, at the end of the day, we're all trying to achieve kind of the same goal here. And through only looking at the lens of the voluntary carbon market, how do you believe that this is actually an effective way to mitigate climate change?
In several ways. First of all, project developers of carbon projects need funding and financing, so that can come through the voluntary carbon markets. We're seeing, an increasing trend towards private sector and corporates wanting to provide the funding and the finance to get these projects off the ground. And again, I'm just going to try and keep this as simple as possible. But what do we mean by these projects? It could be, reforesting degraded land that needs capital. So that is provided could be provided either through governments, but in increasing sort of times that we find ourselves where government finance and funding is constrained, this is where the private sector can step in and play its role. You then have to find a route to market for the carbon credits that are being issued by those projects so that they're profitable, and those credits can then be sold to, again, other corporates who might want to use them, as I described earlier, to compensate for their own emissions. So you've got the funding of the projects, but then essentially you've got to then be able to sort of market and sell the byproduct of those projects, which are the carbon credits in this case.
And as I had kind of mentioned before, since this is a market that's still taking shape and it has a lot of controversy around it, I think it would be really interesting just to hear from your point of view, how do we take into account integrity into this market, and how do we almost overcome those challenges?
The projects have got to be of good quality. Integrity is a word that is being, used a lot, particularly in the carbon markets. And so you can say to yourself, well, what does integrity mean? And I think the whole focus around this is to essentially ensure that the developers of these projects are developing them in a way that warrants the issuance of those carbon credits, i.e. that those tons of CO2 that are being removed or avoided are, real. They are measured correctly. They have been verified. They are additional. What do we mean by additional? this means that that project wouldn't have gone ahead if it wasn't for the carbon revenues. So essentially it needs those carbon revenues in order to be viable. And I think that that's where a lot of the crux around, the incentives that we need to put in place comes into play. I just contrast that with a lot of renewable energy projects now in Europe and the UK. They've already got grid parity, so they don't need carbon credits to be profitable and viable enterprises in their own right. So therefore, they wouldn't qualify under the additionality criteria. That's just to try and illustrate what we mean by that. Permanence is also another important factor. That this time has been removed for a significant period of time, or if not indefinitely, depending on the kind of technology that is being used for those removal credits. And I think that that's what we sort of mean around integrity. There are also other really important aspects of this, again, depending on the types of projects, but this particularly applies to nature-based projects, that there is revenue sharing with communities, i.e. that the communities that are supporting these projects are getting their fair share of the revenues that are being created, which is also really important because this then creates improved livelihoods, improved health, education for women, etc. And I think that it's sort of these additional SDGs that are associated with a lot of these projects that often goes untalked about in the press. So where there is a lot of this scrutiny, we actually forget about this sort of really important aspect of improved livelihoods, improved biodiversity, and a lot of the other co-benefits that are associated with many of these nature-based solutions.
It's a really fascinating insight you share, and we've had a number of people from the carbon space on the podcast so far, but nobody sitting from your exact viewpoint. So it's really great to hear about kind of where you sit. Now, one of the really important things to us on this show is not just the markets. That is hugely important, and we're really focused on educating people. But we also like to talk about the person behind the market and behind the organization. So a bit about your entrepreneurial journey. So I imagine, like every entrepreneur, there's ups and there's downs. And I think I know that from speaking with you before. But I'd love to start off with kind of your proudest moments, those moments since you've started Respira where you've kind of looked around and thought, wow, we've actually really achieved something, and you've got that sense of pride.
I am really proud of the work that we have done in the voluntary carbon markets, and I think the role that we have played in raising awareness of voluntary carbon markets and the role that nature plays and the importance in protecting nature. But I'm particularly proud of the particular sort of business model that we have developed and evolved since we started the business, I think 4 years ago now. What we do is that we support developers of carbon projects by giving them a route to market. We use our own balance sheet to provide long-term offtake agreements to project developers. Similar to what you would do in renewable energy when you put in place a power purchase agreement. So essentially, you're committing to buy the current and forward streams of carbon credits that are going to be issued by those projects. And that's important and useful because it gives the developers of the carbon projects and the communities behind that, guaranteed certainty of cash flows, which they can then use to, forward plan, raise additional funding, or, for whatever other needs. What we did that was, I'm going to be brave enough and use the word innovative when we were devising our offtake agreements, was that we put in place a revenue sharing agreement with the carbon project developers. So we guarantee a floor price, and that's the price that we commit to buy at. So if prices fall below that floor, we're still paying the floor. So to that extent, the project developers have got their downside protected. But then on the upside, we then will also rebate a proportion of the gross margin that we eventually make on those carbon credits. So that enables, again, the project developers and the communities that sit behind that to be able to participate in the appreciation of carbon prices. And I'm really proud of that. I think, especially, now you see increased focus on revenue sharing back to communities. And I think it's great that attention is now really focusing on the places where it's important.
That's great. And you speak about communities a lot. And I think It's an amazing world that you've got kind of your community within Respira. You've got your communities that you're actually partnering with on the carbon project. But I'd also just like to touch on the Women in Carbon community, which I know you've spoken on a panel of and a kind of a proud member of. How do you feel like that kind of supports the industry?
I think it's very important for women to support each other and to provide that safe space where you can be yourself, working with a lot of men. My first stage of my career was in financial markets, and I think probably at the sort of kind of rough end of financial markets. I certainly know how difficult it can be to be a woman and to be recognized and valued by our attributes and ways of thinking and acting and interacting. And I'm not of the school where I want to put stereotypes on things, but certainly I think our approach to problem solving, to interacting, to emoting can be quite difficult for men. So if you're surrounded by a lot of men, you can sort of sometimes see them going, "Oh, is she going to get emotional right now? Oh my God, what's going to happen here?" Or something really annoying like that. And you're thinking, "I'm not emotional. I'm just passionate. Deal with it." So I think to have a space where women can support each other is fantastic, and it's really important, and to just be able to discuss things openly without thinking that, oh, how am I going to be perceived or how am I going to be judged? It's really important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And talking about kind of the need for support, and I mentioned this before, the journey of an entrepreneur is not always all exciting. There are the highs and the lows. Speaking of kind of the opposite end of the spectrum to those kind of moments of pride and positivity, I'm sure there's been some kind of real challenges along the way. So can you give us some insight into what they've looked like in terms of the biggest challenges you've faced and also how you've overcome them?
The challenges of setting up a business are numerous. I think it also depends as well on what industry you're setting up a business in. When we set up Respira, I think we were at the very early stages of what I call the carbon markets 2.0, the 1.0 being the Kyoto CDM days of the carbon markets, and we were a young team in a market that wasn't shaped yet. So I think we were partly on that journey of shaping this new incarnation of the VCM, and going out and raising money with a new business model is quite difficult, right? And I think we were very, very lucky to get very early support from Capricorn. Capricorn in the US, they've been a fantastic shareholder and they're very impact driven. So I really mean this, amazing to be supported by them. But the fundraising is ongoing, and it's always difficult to raise money, but it's much more difficult to raise money when you've got a new sort of kind of business model in a relatively new sector that's evolving. I mean, just to give you an example. So, you're writing out your business plan, and what do you use to model carbon prices when actually, at the time there were no carbon pricing curves, for example. So it's all very much based on assumptions. So the lows are fundraising, always fundraising. It's always a lot harder than you think it's going to be, and it's going to take a lot longer than you think it's going to take.
No, absolutely. And I guess just as kind of a segue onto that, you obviously have faced a lot of challenges within that in building Respira and your own career, but would also be really interesting to know is what are some of those valuable lessons that you've learned throughout your career, maybe not necessarily only throughout Respira, that have really influenced your commitment to the kind of impact-driven work that you do today? What kind of keeps you going?
What keeps me going is how important nature is and how important nature is to climate change. And sometimes I get really depressed when I see the amount of attacks that, directed at the voluntary carbon markets. I just sort of kind of think, why are you attacking? What is still relatively a small sector, right? If 158 billion was was invested in nature-based solutions last year. I mean, only 2 billion of that are from the voluntary carbon markets, and yet it's so key and it's so important. And all this negativity really needs to be turned around, and we have to focus a lot more on the sort of crucial importance of restoring nature, protecting nature, because we're all paying the price. I mean, you watch the news, and what do we have every year? It's sort of heat waves, and the heat waves get worse and worse and worse. And I don't know, 52 degrees in Spain, forest fires that just burn in an unprecedented way in Canada. The list goes on. Floods, hurricanes. The price is paid throughout. Your insurance premiums are going up. You speak to insurers now, and they'll say that certain real estate assets in the developed world now are uninsurable because of the effects of climate change. So I think that's what keeps me going. We just need to keep drumming that drum hard and not giving up.
And thinking back to your earlier career, and it's something I think a lot of us do when you get to a certain point of your career, what would I go back and tell my younger self? And you mentioned this at the start, you became kind of a campaigner later on in your career. If you could go back and start again, is there anything that you tell your younger self to do different?
No, because if I did, I wouldn't be where I am now. Have I made mistakes? I have made tons of mistakes. I mean, tons and tons of mistakes. But if I hadn't made all of those mistakes, I wouldn't have learned all the lessons that I have learned now and have enabled me to be where I am now and to have the conviction that I have now. I'm sure there are many things I could have done better or differently, but I believe in path dependency, right? One step leads to another step, and so I'm really happy to be doing the work that I'm doing right now. I just hope that we are successful in it.
No, I'm absolutely sure you will be. And I think so much of the success in this sector comes from the passion that people have, because you see a lot of sectors that are more straightforward. You don't actually need quite as much conviction. I think one where you're constantly battling against the press and against a lot of controversy, it needs that kind of human passion and the power of teams. And having had the pleasure of meeting some of your team, I think you've built an amazing team of people, and that in itself goes such a long way towards making sure that you do achieve the success that you deserve.
Thank you. I hope so.
I guess it's actually really nice to hear that you wouldn't do anything any differently. But flipping that question around very slightly, for those people who are kind of embarking on their careers now, either coming out of school or out of university, or perhaps they're in their first job and feeling a little bit disenfranchised by what they're doing if they're not working in kind of a career with purpose, what advice would you give to those people about how they can enter into this space, be it the voluntary carbon market or kind of the broader clean tech or clean energy industry?
If you really want something, then you just have to keep bashing away until you get it and not give up. And it's really difficult. I think in this particular sector, I hope that the opportunities are still huge and that it's open, and I believe that. So if people want to get into the voluntary carbon markets, I would think. But I'd love to know from you, Alexa, whether this is the case. But I think this should be a relatively easy space to get into. I think it's probably much harder if you say, well, I want to be an investment banker and I want to work at Goldman Sachs. Then I think the competition is going to be a lot greater. So if you know what you really want to do, then my advice is always just don't give up. And if you get knocked down, don't give up. And if you get knocked down again, don't give up, because eventually you will succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is really good advice. And it's been so amazing to really see more and more people show interest specifically in this sector from all ages, even just seeing it from our own Women in Carbon events. We have students, I think our youngest attendee was 16 years old, also wanting to know what was happening. And it's really important to also have just that kind of diversity of mindsets and thoughts and everything. And we really see this as a growing market, which is so amazing. I guess also what I wanted to ask you is, what do you think needs to happen in this market for us to ensure its success? what do you kind of see in the future? How do you see it taking shape?
I hope it's not a fantasy, but my dream is that compliance markets open up to allow for voluntary carbon credits into them, and that we pull in all sectors of the economy to fall under the regulated compliance markets, but that those compliance markets allow for voluntary carbon credits as well, so that it's not just, yes, corporates have to decarbonize, but instead of issuing allowances, let's allow for the use of voluntary carbon credits as well, because that's another way of channeling that very much needed private capital to nature. So that I think could have a huge impact, but I'm not sure how much of a pipe dream that is.
No, I think that's definitely a good dream, and I hope that a lot of people would also agree with that. Maybe from more of a Respira perspective, what do you see as Respira's plan for the future or the vision of the company?
Well, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. Our main focus is to channel private capital into the global south, into nature-based projects. So a very important part of our activities is to keep raising that institutional capital into different types of investment vehicles, so that we can then use that to support and underwrite the projects that we're working with. We would like to see this becoming much more of an institutional asset class, investable asset class, and it's through having the ability to generate financial returns for all involved, that we can, I think, create the sort of kind of incentives also for the institutional capital to enter this sector. I mean, we said that at the beginning, that it's about rewarding nature for what it does and putting a price on the ecosystem services that nature provides. And you need to have a market, therefore, for that, and that's really the sort of core of our activities and what we're going to continue to do. And then working with corporates on the other side, who've got credible decarbonization pathways and who are looking to use carbon credits as compensation along that pathway once they get to their own net zero.
Brilliant. Well, I mean, it's great to hear the vision. It's very clear. You're clearly very driven to get there, and I think we have no doubt that you'll do it, and are honoured to be a small part of your journey in getting there. But I just wanted to touch back on one thing that you said earlier, because I think it's really important to us as a business, was around kind of this being a space that it is easy for people to enter, and I couldn't agree more. Of all the careers out there, joining an exponentially growing young industry should be the easiest place to get into. So for those people who are thinking this could be a possible career, the time is certainly now to enter. There are not lots of experts out there. There are very few. So if you have the right passion and the right conviction, and you believe in this sector, then definitely you should be considering a career in it. So thanks for touching on that, Anna, and thank you for joining us today and telling us your story, and also for the amazing work that you're doing in the carbon markets.
Thank you very much for having me. It's actually been a pleasure.
Lovely. And thank you for being a great co-host, Alexa. I will invite you back.
Happy to always come back.
Thank you. Take care.